First, I'd like to call up Ken Quinn, speaking in favor from U.S. term limits. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you, Chairman Vorpagel, Vice Chairman Schra. My name is Ken Quinn, committee members. I'm from Maine, so I want to first of all thank you for providing such nice weather to make me feel comfortable here, so I appreciate that.
Well, feel free to take it back with you.
Now we just need some snow in Maine so I can do some skiing. I'm with U.S. term limits, and I'm here in support of AJR 77 because one of the subject matters is a term limit amendment for Congress. This is an issue that has overwhelming support of the American people. 82% of Americans would like to see term limits on Congress. What's unique about it is this issue polls extremely high across all political parties, 76% Democrats, 83% independents, and 89% Republicans. It's probably the one issue in the country today that can actually bring both sides together. The American people are sick and tired of what's going on in Washington right now. It's broken. Congress is dysfunctional, and the members of Congress no longer listens to the American people. They do listen to their funders, however. And in a recent study by Princeton, basically proves the fact that if 80% of Americans want something, Congress won't do it. But if their funders want something, they will. And our voices are no longer being heard. We currently have over 5,000 years of institutional knowledge sitting in Congress right now. What is it getting us? We heard earlier about the $22 trillion in debt. We have an immigration crisis, a healthcare cost crisis. We are able to keep the government functioning through continuing resolutions because they can't get their act together. This is nonsense. We need a functioning government. We need to have term limits to get rid of these individuals who care more about their own self-interest and maintaining their power, and replace them with citizens who know they have a short period of time to get the job done that their voters sent them to do. With term limits, we can achieve that. It is not the silver bullet, but what it will do is will refresh our government so that we'll have new people with fresh ideas to provide solutions to the crisis we're facing. Now, we obviously support this issue because term limits has been around for a very long time. In fact, you may recall back, I'll go back way back to the Articles of Confederation. Our first constitution had term limits. Back then they called it rotation of office. Many of the state constitutions had rotation of office. In the early 1990s, term limits for Congress was huge in our country. 23 states passed laws, most of them by the people at the ballot box, to put term limits on their own members of Congress. In 1995, the Supreme Court overturned all of those state laws in the case U.S. term limits versus Thornton. And what the court determined and ruled was this: the only way the states can accomplish this is through Article 5, the amending provision. So it can only come by an amendment to the Constitution. Now, there's two ways to propose amendments. We need 2/3 of both houses of Congress to pass the amendment and send it out to the states' ratification. Who in this room honestly believes Congress is going to pass by 2/3 majority a term limit amendment on themselves? It's not going to happen. That is why the framers in their wisdom gave the states a check and gave the states equal authority to propose amendments. And it's time that the state legislatures listen to the people and propose this the way they wanted. They wanted this years ago. And it's time that we did it with the president. We have the 22nd Amendment because people wanted it. We have many amendments that have corrected the problems of our country. The 13th Amendment, voting rights for women, voting rights for 18-year-olds. This is how we address critical needs in our nation. And the states need to have a voice in this process. We cannot leave it up to Congress to do that. The couple things I do want to address is the process. But before I leave to go to that topic, I want to read a quote here. This is about rotation. The rotation in the Senate would also, in my opinion, be of great use. It is now probable that senators once chosen for a state will, as the system now stands, continue in office for life. The office will be honorable if not lucrative. The persons who occupy it will probably wish to continue in it and therefore use all their influence and that of their friends to continue in office. Their friends will be numerous and powerful, for they will have it in their power to confer great favors. Everybody acquainted with public affairs knows how difficult it is to remove from office a person who has been long in it. It is seldom done except in cases of gross misconduct, unquote. That was from Robert Yates, 1787, at the convention. They understood human nature. See, we can't vote out human nature. And that is why not allowing people to remain in office for life is a good thing. Too much power for too long a period of time is not good for our nation. Now, in regards to the Article 5 convention, I used to completely oppose this idea. I was on the other side. I believed it was a constitutional convention. I believe we don't have the rules. How would it work? They would rewrite the Constitution. I used to actually hand out to legislators in Maine a DVD that said, "Beware of Article 5." It was produced by the John Birch Society. This is where I was getting the information from. Well, once I started doing my own research, I realized what I was being told about this process was not true. And in the package I provided you, I'm taking most of the arguments you'll hear from the opposition, and I'm not taking it out of context. I'm providing you the actual document so you can read it for yourself, which is what really turned me on to realizing this is something we need to use. We need to embrace Article 5 and use it to solve our problems. Number one is I went through the notes that were taken at the convention and realized the framers from the very first day of the convention of 1787 introduced the convention that ultimately is Article 5. Charles Pinckney, he actually brought a complete constitution on day one of the 1787 convention because that convention was called to draft a new constitution. And I'll get more into that in just a minute. Here's his provision. If 2/3 of the legislatures of the states apply for the same, it was requirement of the 2/3 of the states to apply for the same amendment. It was limited to what 2/3 agreed upon. It's not an open convention, it's controlled. And on August 6th, the first draft of the Constitution reported out by the Committee of Detail, they had it at that point, it was Article 19, quote, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states in the Union for an amendment of this Constitution, the legislature of the United States shall call a convention for that purpose. So it was limited to what 2/3 of the states agreed on. On the last day of the convention, the wording had changed throughout the course of the 1787 convention, but the way it was finalized is it allowed Congress to propose if 2/3 passed it. It also allowed Congress to call a convention for the states if 2/3 agreed on the subject matter. So it's controlled by that subject matter alone. Nothing else outside of that can be introduced. Now, immediately after they approved the language of Article 5, a motion was made to give Article 5 the same power as a constitutional convention, and that was declined. They voted that down. So this is not a constitutional convention, and there's a big difference between the two types of conventions. And I provide that in the packet. It takes unanimous consent for a constitutional convention to be called, so it's completely different. This is 2/3 and then ratifications by 3/4. That cannot be changed also. Article 5 is the law, and so the law cannot be changed in the middle of the ballgame. In Federalist 40, and this is where the myth of the runaway convention all comes from, and this is what I used to believe, that Congress called the 1787 convention solely for the purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. And what happened? The delegates showed up in Philadelphia, and within a few weeks, they threw out the articles and drafted a whole new constitution. That's a lie. The truth is this. Virginia called the convention, and they called it specifically based on the recommendation from the Annapolis Convention of the previous year. You see, this is how states used to deal with problems. We have a long, rich history of conventions of states. We have, I think, documented over 40 of these in our history. And the recommendation from Annapolis said this, quote, appointment of commissioners to take into consideration the situation of the United States, to devise such further provisions as shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. That all 12 states that sent commissioners had that language in their commissions. And the commissions is what legally binds the delegates. That is the legal authority they have at a convention. Now, Congress, 7 or 5 months later, they offered their opinion, and Congress just wanted the articles to be revised. However, the delegates had full authority to do what they did. They were sent there not to preserve the Articles of Confederation. They were there to preserve the Union. And that's the argument James Madison makes in Federalist 40, and he just blows away this myth that they exceeded their authority. He does mention this. He says, in one particular, it is admitted that the convention have departed from the tenor of their commission. Instead of reporting a plan requiring the confirmation of the legislatures of all the states, they have reported a plan which is to be confirmed by the people and may be carried into effect by 9 states only. They changed the ratification. That was a proposal. Well, that was written only 3 months after the convention adjourned. What took place in history is that all 13 state legislatures approved of the new process, approved of the new ratification process by calling state ratifying conventions of the people. So it was approved unanimously, and all 13 states ratified the Constitution, fulfilling this. So that even that one little point is no longer valid. It was a moot argument back then, and that's still being used today to try to discredit what the framers did. I'd like to turn your attention to Federalist 85 real quick. Alexander Hamilton expressly explains how this is a limited process. He says this, but every amendment to the Constitution, if once established, so once it's ratified, would be a single proposition, and might be brought forward singly. There would be no necessity for management or compromise in relation to any other point, no giving nor taking. The will of the requisite number would at once bring the matter to a decisive issue. And consequently, whenever 9, that's your 2/3, or rather 10 states, that's the ratification. So he's talking about the convention. Whenever 9 or rather 10 states were united in the desire of a particular amendment, that amendment must infallibly take place. So this process is a limited process to one amendment or whatever the subject matter 2/3 agree upon. You may have seen a quote. I'm sure you're probably getting emails from the opponents that James Madison, he trembled at the thought of another convention. They like to take that out of context. This is the context, and I took the liberty to provide you the talking points of the opponents, but I kept it in the context so you can actually read it. Madison, when he wrote that, the new federal government had not even begun yet. New York sent out a circular letter wanting a new convention. They wanted to revise the whole Constitution, and here is all the amendments New York wanted. It was an open convention, and Madison's referring to that. He wasn't referring to what we're talking about today. He said, listen, slow it down. Let's let the government at least begin, and let's see what we really need before we start making changes to it. So he's referring to the context. In fact, even in the very letter that they lift this quote from, he describes the 2 types of conventions. One requiring unanimous consent, which is a constitutional convention, the other 2/3, which is in Article 5. So please, I encourage you to read this so you have the complete context. Lastly here, what did the framers really intend is provable by the first debate of Congress. This is May 1789. The federal government began in March. The states, Virginia, filed the first Article 5 application. They wanted the Bill of Rights. Remember, most of the states wanted the Bill of Rights before ratification. Promises were made. Well, Virginia wasn't going to wait for Congress to do it. They wanted to take action. Well, in the very debates upon this application, you will see that now keep in mind, you might not be aware of this, the first Congress, over 50 of the members of the first Congress were either members at the 1787 convention or they were delegates at their state ratifying conventions. They understood what Article 5 meant. And let me just read to you some of their discussion. Mr. Boudinot said this: according to the terms of the Constitution, the business cannot be taken up until certain number of states have concurred in similar applications. They need to agree. Mr. Madison said he had no doubt, but the House was inclined to treat the present application with respect. But he doubted the propriety of committing because it would seem to imply that the House had a right to deliberate upon the subject. This, he believed, was not the case until 2/3 of the state legislatures concurred in such applications. And then it is out of the power of Congress to decline complying. He understood Congress has no role in this. None whatsoever. They call it, which is basically summoning the states to come to a meeting, time and place, and they will decide how any amendments, if passed, will be ratified. That's it. They don't make the rules, they don't choose the delegates, nothing else. He says, from hence it must appear that Congress has no deliberative power on this occasion. The most respectful and constitutional mode of performing our duty will be to let it be entered on the minutes and remain upon the files of the House until similar applications come to hand from 2/3 of the states. Over and over again, I've highlighted these so you can look at them yourself. They understood this was not an open convention. The states must agree ahead of time. And in fact, in 1987, so 200 years later, the U.S. Department of Justice issued a report because back in the 80s, the states were getting very close to call a convention for a balanced budget amendment. In this report, they make it expressly clear that the states have every right and ability to limit this process. It says this: since it is undisputed that Congress possesses the authority to propose amendments limited to a single topic or groups of topics, it follows that the applications of the states for calling a constitutional convention may also be limited. I wish they wouldn't use that term constitutional convention because it's really a convention for proposing amendments, but they prove that this is limited. And I just want to share with you, Congress has introduced 12,000 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. They've passed 33 by the 2/3, ratified 27. The states have not introduced a single amendment. I thought this was about checks and balances. This process gives the states the same opportunity Congress has taken advantage of over 12,000 times. This year alone, Congress has introduced 60 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. 60. Now, some of these are great amendments, but they'll never see the light of day because they cannot get their act together. So it's up to you as state legislators to do your duty, fulfill your responsibility as state legislators under Article 5, and pick up the slack. The idea that we don't know how this would function, this is what I want to share in closing, is that all states, in fact, Wisconsin, you are doing this right now. Currently, there's a convention of states held every single year, an official convention of states. All 50 states send commissioners. It's called the Uniform Law Commission. Now, the only difference is that in this body, instead of proposing amendments to the Constitution, it proposes uniform state laws. But it operates just like an Article 5 convention. Let me share with you the similarities. The commissioners are sent. I don't know how many commissioners. I think Wisconsin has about 10 commissioners. I can send that to you if you would like to know. So the number of commissioners are different amongst the states. Typically, they're appointed by the governor. Some legislators might appoint. I don't know all the details on that. When they arrive, they have their commissions, which states what they're allowed to discuss, debate, and vote on. That's the legal documents. They have a scope and program committee. That basically functions as Congress to predetermine what the subject matter will be, so it's limited. They draft. They have drafting committees, just like an Article 5 convention would be. They have a committee of the whole. I attended one of these a few years ago. All the delegations were at their desks. They had their flags. It was a great process to watch. This is how it works. It's one state, one vote, just like in Article 5. Okay. If they pass anything, it's known as a model act. They've passed over 300 of these, and since 1892, they meet every year. A majority of states must present. A majority of the states present must approve the legislation before it is formally proposed to the states. Once it's proposed, The commissioners then bring the act back to the state legislature to be adopted as law. In fact, Wisconsin, you have 3 of these before you right now that have come out of a convention of states. And so we do have the rules. We know how the process works. We've been using it since 1892. And that is not even talking about how the states themselves have conventions to either amend their own constitution. We've had over 233 conventions within the states to either propose or draft a new constitution or to propose amendments to their current constitution. Out of those conventions, 6,000 amendments have been adopted by the states that come from conventions. So we know how this works. And so I encourage you to please support and vote for the process. Don't if you don't like the policy, I understand, but please do not fear the process, because this is what the framers gave us as a way to have a functioning government amongst the federal level, the national level and the state level. So I encourage you to please support AJR 77, and would also like for you to support term limits for Congress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Quinn. I think you gave some good answers to some questions that had come up, and certainly some concerns and questions that I had in learning about this process as well.